Hello, we're looking at our fourth and final perceptual learning activity for our hypothesis testing module 10b. And in this case, we're going to decide whether we should retain the null hypothesis distribution or reject it. And there's a couple things that we can take in consideration. One of them is the p-value resulting from our analysis. So if the p-value is equal to or less than the alpha level, generally set to 0.05, then we go ahead and reject the null hypothesis distribution. If the p-value is big, then that's telling us that, hey, we've got a pretty good null hypothesis distribution. The sample mean we got is very believable within the context of it. And a p-value of 0.368, that's definitely greater than 0.05. So good job, null hypothesis distribution. We're going to go ahead and retain it. Now, a p-value of 0.045, that is less than or equal to our alpha level of 0.05. So as a result, we're going to go ahead and reject the null hypothesis distribution. Our sample mean is outside of this middle 95%. It's not where we would expect based upon the null hypothesis distribution, so we reject the null hypothesis distribution. Okay, we have a null hypothesis distribution. Our sample mean is such that the probability of it occurring given this null hypothesis distribution is 0.368. That's pretty believable. It's definitely bigger than 0.05. That's as long as the p-value is bigger than 0.05, we're going to say the null hypothesis distribution is believable. So we're not very picky here, right? So 0.368, that's greater than 0.05. We retain our null hypothesis distribution. Now we got a p-value of 0.003. This sample mean, if we were to believe the null hypothesis distribution, it would say that the probability of sample mean occurring is 0.003. That's really low. This isn't a very good fit between our sample mean and null hypothesis distribution. So we'll go ahead and reject the null hypothesis distribution. Okay, we have a p-value of 0.021. Again, that's below or equal to our 0.05 cutoff, our alpha level. So we're not going to put a lot of stock in this null hypothesis distribution. A big p-value, we would be all over that null hypothesis distribution, but it's a small one. It's less than or equal to 0.05, so we reject the null hypothesis distribution. Okay, so now we're being shown a null hypothesis distribution, and the work's all done for us to calculate a z-test. That's really nice. So we just get to look at the z-test and decide, are we going to retain or reject the null hypothesis distribution? So you need to think just briefly about the empirical rule. The empirical rule says that approximately 95% of the population is within plus or minus 2 standard deviations or 2 standard errors. Now that's an approximation. If we want to get to the nitty-gritty, it's actually that 95% are within plus or minus 1.96 standard errors. And, well, 1.9, that is within the 1.96 standard errors. So good job, null hypothesis distribution. You just barely made it. We're going to retain you. Now we have a z-test of negative 2.3. That is definitely equal to or beyond our plus minus 1.96. You can see that the sample mean is out here at the edge. It's definitely not in the middle where the null hypothesis distribution said it should be. So we're going to reject this null hypothesis distribution. A z-test of 1.9, that's within our plus minus 1.96. It's in that middle 0.95. We'll retain the null hypothesis distribution. Z-test of 3.0, we're going to reject. It's outside of our 1.96. P-value of 0.054. You know what? We're going to retain this null hypothesis distribution. If it had just been 0.05 or less, we would have rejected it. But it just barely passed the threshold for keeping it, right? The bigger the p-value, the more likely we're going to keep it. And as long as it's as long as it's bigger than 0.05, we're going to keep it. It's a keeper. Okay, the z-test is negative 2.3. That means our sample mean was 2.3 standard errors below where the null hypothesis distribution said it should be. So null hypothesis distribution didn't do a very good job. It's like someone going to stock market and picking all the stocks and they lost big. You're like, I'm not going to invest with that person again, right? So reject the null hypothesis. A z-test of 0.9, that's definitely within the range of where the null hypothesis distribution said it should be, so we retain it. A p-value of 0.054, we've seen this before. It just barely squeaks by for us to keep it, since the p-value is, well, it's not big, but it is bigger than 0.05, and that's all it needed to be to retain it. A z-test of 2.1, that's beyond our plus minus 1.96, so we reject. Z-test of negative 2.0, again, that's beyond our plus minus 1.96, reject. P-value of 0.368, hey, that's great, it's bigger than 0.05, we'll retain the null. Retain. P-value of 0.066, we're going to retain the null. It's bigger than 0.05, it's within our 0.95 here in the middle, so we keep it. P-value of 0.142, so again we're going to retain the null hypothesis distribution. The sample mean was close enough to the middle that, you know, the fact that it wasn't exactly on the middle can be explained by just natural variation. We keep it. Z-test of negative 0.6, the sample mean is pretty close to where the null hypothesis distribution said we should find it, so we keep it. P-value of 0.03. Look, that sample mean is much more towards the edge. Our p-value was less than or equal to our alpha level. That means we reject the null. The smaller the p-value, the less believable, and if it's 0.05 or less, we say not believable. This is all about how believable is that null hypothesis distribution. A z-test of negative 2.3, and we're like, not believable. It's beyond that plus minus 1.96. A p-value of 0.045, again, small p-value you reject, a big p-value you get to keep. How big is big? Anything bigger than 0.05 is big, and you retain. This isn't that big, so we reject. Z-test of 1.9, that's within our plus minus 1.96. It's a keeper, we'll keep the null hypothesis distribution. P-value of 0.066, that's going to be a keeper. It's bigger than alpha level, so we keep going with the null hypothesis distribution. Close enough. P-value of 0.003. Okay, that's too small, right? If the p-value is our alpha level 0.05 or less, we're like, that's just too small. But p-value, I'm rejecting the null. P-value of 0.054. It just barely made it for us to retain the null hypothesis. Again, 0.05 or less, when we would have rejected it, just squeaks by for us to retain it. 0.021, if that is equal to or less than our alpha level 0.05, we reject. We consider this null hypothesis distribution not believable. And again, when the p-value is small, we're going to see that the sample mean is pretty far out there. P-value of 0.036, again, we're going to reject our null hypothesis distribution. We're going to say it's not believable. The sample mean is just too far away from where it was supposed to be. Z-test of negative 1.9, well, that is within our plus minus 1.96, so we retain, and that's it. And then when we click next, we'll get a completion code, and for this particular quiz attempt, it was 94, but when you take it, it'll very likely be something different, likewise for other students. All right, take care.